how did you deal with death? And the answer to that, I think, whatever everybody will have a different answer, but the individual answer will give you insights as to how perhaps this guy led his life or his subsequent things that happened to him, good, bad, or indifferent, could be related back to that. I think because the way you dealt with that. Some, of course, didn't deal with it very well, and it became mental problems, all sorts of drugs, the whole enchilada, the drugs, the alcohol, all that. And those that did deal with it did okay.
That's linked to one of the passages in your book that I wanted to read and I wanted to ask you a couple questions about.
Sure, sure, sure.
And you're referring to Short Shaft, the nickname,
Short shaft, yes.
right? Short Shaft, who was killed.
Yeah,
And here's what you write. I approached the future in Vietnam differently concerning death. With the death of Short Shaft, I found that the best way to handle death was not to think about it, try to ignore it, and when it did happen, to move on quickly,
yeah,
look for something else to occupy my mind. And then you say a regrettable offshoot of that approach included not getting too friendly with anyone,
yeah,
as they may leave suddenly.
yeah.
And I'm interested in hearing just you respond to that passage generally, but I did have a particular question. And because over the years, I've picked up kind of a paradox that combat veterans talk about the very strong bond that they have
Yes, yes,
with others in combat and this strong reliance that they have on one another. And you refer to that in your own memoir,
yeah.
the guys you really felt you could trust, you developed that relationship. This strong bond, this intense bond that many veterans never experience anywhere else, a
Right,
bond that
right.
intense. And at the same time, combat veterans will often say what you said at the same time,
Yeah,
maintain this psychological distance.
yes.
I'm always, and I think it's probably impossible to explain this to someone who hasn't experienced it, but interested in just in your thoughts about how do these things go together? On the one hand, I maintain psychological distance. On the other hand, I have this incredibly tight bond.
Um, yeah, that's paradoxical. The short staff business was very early in my tour. I think maybe 2 months into it, and it was so searing and unworldly. And he and I slept in a hooch. He was 3 feet away from me for the whole time we were there, and knew we arrived together. New guys develop a bond together. You're similar, and you're new guys and you're rookies, and you could just kind of link. You automatically bond. Um, but my long term, the way I would answer the question I was going to I asked was, uh, I would thankfully I was so busy. We were all busy all the time. Nobody was sitting around with time on their hands. So you're always so dadgum busy, and you just throw yourself into the work, and there's no time to consider any of this stuff. You work, maintain, work, 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 sleep, get up, and go do it all over again. So my answer to my own question would be, I would say I probably compartmentalized that pretty well for for the time I was there. But you always, in my case, it was 3 or 4 days after I got home, I just broke down. One night, I remembered all that stuff and cried almost all night. I mean, it was just uh, so it always comes back to you. But I think by being able to get into something else important quickly, when it does come back, it doesn't have the full violence of the initial moment, and so that's the long term. The friendships, yes, develop friendships. So of course,
So is there maybe an unconscious process where, as you're working with these other pilots and the others that you're working with, um, and you feel this tight bond with them, but is there at the same time sort of an maybe even an conscious yet unconscious
Yeah,
recognition that you have to be able to let this person go?
I think so.
Yeah,
No question. No question.
yeah.
Um, I don't think you say, well, okay, and I don't want to get too close to old Paladin because he may go away quickly. I mean, I didn't go through that thought process, but it's always there. And it was in my case based on short shaft. When that went away, I can still feel the pain of that. It was just indescribable. And he was a great guy, and everybody loved him. And suddenly he is gone, and that's pretty devastating.
You just have to move on.
Yes,
What happened to him? What happened to Short Shaft?
he he was a Cobra pilot, and I told you we slept close to each other, or we slept in the same hooch. We were new guys, and platoons were segregated. Scout platoon, lift platoon, Cobra platoon had their own hooches, own specific hooches. They were pretty. They were. It was okay. New guys were kind of glumped together in kind of a headquarters area until room was made available for you in your platoon, and room became available when somebody died, typically. But there was shuffling around that could be done. But anyhow, he was a Cobra pilot, and as I said, a very new guy. Cobra pilots required, for very good reason, required more time to learn their jobs than other pilots because of what they did. Um, very, very important. So he was in that. He had not completed it. Uh, we got a call, one of those emergency calls that one of our guys was down north of a place called Loch Nen. And so two Cobras scrambled to go provide cover for him as the ground guys got to him, all the guys on the ground. And he went with a guy named with a captain, a senior captain who had not been there very long and was not he had been qualified as a Cobra command pilot, but he was still very, very young in terms of experience. And the thinking was he just got in a situation that was not he wasn't prepared for. Both were killed. Both he was they were shot down, I believe, by 51 caliber anti or 51 calibers, which were deadly, and were just they died. They both died as a result of inexperience and probably some hubris on the part of the captain. He was a very good man. His old man was a colonel, and he was a mover. He was going to be very, very good, but he just let his mouth overload his butt in his case, and so that's how Short Shaft died. He was in the front seat, and that's how he died.
So this process that you've talked about where you realize, okay, because you've got what about 10 months to go in your tour, right? So you just decide you just have to let it go. And I mean, is this something you figure out within a couple hours of learning the news, or because I'm assuming there's something coming right up that you have to turn your attention to?
It I, I think my scouting, my career in Vietnam was essentially three quadrants, three trimeters. There was the first 3.5 months I was a scout, or I was a lift pilot. I was a Huey pilot. Then for about 4.5 months I was a scout pilot, very intense. And then the last 3.5 months I was troop XO, and I was involved in logistics stuff and moving. So the first period was when I was in Huey's, and life was a little slower then. So I stayed in Huey's another 5 6 weeks after that. But I just I was so new. I was groping I didn't intentionally say, well, how am I going to forget about short shaft? It's a daily thing. There's his bunk, there's his stuff. Um,
Oh,
and we went to formations together and all that. So I think I just worked my way through it. I didn't have any idea as to how I didn't even realize I was figuring out how to deal with death necessarily. You just do it. You just do it. It just happens. You're a thinking human being, and yeah, he's always there, but gets a little further away from you.
yeah. I wanted to connect that with something else that you wrote, another um, heavy story. There are a number of heavy stories that you write about. Um, and this one involves leader. And so the details of what happened escape me right now. So please do fill it in.
Yeah, yeah,
But you're talking to leader, and leader says to you, Dave, I killed him.
yeah,
And then you respond, good, thinking
yeah.
that leader was referring to a
Right.
Vietcong.
Yes.
Leader said, no, 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 I killed Oscar, who's
Yeah.
the enlisted guy with him
Yeah.
in the loach. Leader choked. He had an unholy look on his face, and his eyes were huge as he said, Oscar was burning alive. He pleaded with me. He was screaming. I couldn't get him out. I
Yeah.
shot him in his face.
Yeah.
And then Leader quickly unplugged his communications cord, folded his arms across his chest, slumped into the seat with his head bowed onto
Yeah.
his chest.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could just spell out that story, what happened. But also, there's this just question that I have. Just are these two stories are events that if one of them happened to a person, this would be a heavy memory that that person would carry through his life. But in a short period of time, when you're a very young man,
Yeah.
you're accumulating a lot of these heavy stories. And I increasingly I'm thinking of these stories and these memories as kind of weights.
Hmm.
This memory weighs 3 pounds and it's hanging on me.
Right.
This memory weighs 4 pounds, it's hanging on me. And as I think about what I just read to what leader said to you and what leader did, do you think that I mean that this is right, that over a year's experience of combat, and I understand in the latter part of your tour, you're in a more administrative role, but you certainly see a lot of combat in your tour in Vietnam. Does that kind of make sense that as these things happen, even though on the one hand you're working hard not to be um, distracted by them because there's always something else to do. I mean, is there just kind of an accumulative burden that just inevitably just wears a person down that makes it almost impossible to keep this up for very long?
I think it certainly can, and that's an interesting way to analogy the weights. I never I never thought of it in those terms, although it was always present. Um, and it, if you recall, at the end of the book, when I went to the Gone but Not Forgotten wall that we used, at that point, I there graphically were the names with the name tapes. And so I think at that point it hit me that these people were gone. But in terms of a burden or has it affected me or we could one of your last questions concerns what is Vietnam to me today? It's I, I have the combat, the action with leader was horrible. That was just terrible. Terrible thing happened, and he has not recovered. Oh, by the way, you, he's he is in a mental institution in South Dakota, and he he came back after the war, he came back to Army, as we all did, and he just wasn't very good. And he was a good officer, very good officer, but he got involved in alcohol and was busted a couple times and became an enlisted man. And uh, he retired as an NCO, but he was an officer, so you always retire to highest rank. So he retired as a captain or a major, maybe. Um, but he was unable to handle that for whatever reason, and he was a hardcore person. That was his second tour. We loved him because he'd been on the ground first tour, knew what we did, a little older guy, and he was a great buffer between us and the leadership, and we just loved him because of that, because of his he was hard as a woodpecker lips and just a stout guy. But this dragged him down, and so the weight business applied to him, and it certainly to others in the Vietnam era veterans who haven't been able to cope for whatever reason. But the only I can speak for myself, and for whatever reason, I haven't thought about it much. It was there. It is there. Those things happened. They're a part of me today. Um, but I, I, I rarely think about it. I never dream about it. Uh, so, so there are two extremes there, I think.
What happened? What's the story? What happened to this incident with Leader and the Oscar? What's that background story?
Uh, so leader was on a normal, we call it VR, visual reconnaissance mission, but he was on one of those. Um, Again, north of where we were living in a place. We were living in a place called Quan Loy, Quanloy. It was a long runway, um, and he. I should tell you, a overriding dadgum cloud that was omnipresent in everything we did. I think was the border. We were near the border.
Cambodia, Vietnam.
Yeah, Cambodia, Vietnam, exactly. And it was Ho Chi Minh Trail ran down through that, and they just vomited all their stuff into Vietnam. And so that we were very sensitive to that because there was all kind of enemy stuff there. It was always very hot, very active. So the border was an important part of our lives, and you never ever wanted to get overfly it because you wouldn't come home, uh, and you didn't want to get particularly near to it for the same reason. Um, so Leader was north doing a normal VR. He flew into something we call the Devil's Snare. And the Devil's Snare was a specific anti-aircraft uh, position dug in by typically North Vietnamese, although the VC used them a lot, but the North Vietnamese were the smart guys, and they brought the equipment, had the equipment, and they would erect those things, literally erect them. I mean, they point to the sky, and over air avenues of approach that we appeared to use a lot. That's where they wanted to be. And so when one of those things struck, it was always death. And every time I remember somebody hit one of those things or they hit him, somebody died. One of our guys died, as it did in this case. So Leader flew into this devil's nest, and you can't see them. They're almost unavoidable. They just happen, and you try to avoid them. But once they're identified, you avoid them like the plague. You don't go near them. So I hear this call on the radio. I'm doing a normal VR south of Honolulu. Every unpleasant radio call that ever happened in our unit was preceded by the pro words guidons, guidons, guidons. So when you heard that on the radio, something bad has happened. Stand by. More to follow. So I heard guidons three times. A white 6, which is the platoon leader, which was leader, is down. And so I got more, everything stops. You just stop what you're doing, get to altitude, get out of NR, or get out of small arms range, and wait for further instructions. So my instructions I received was, please fly to the spot. Um, a leader is down, and it's pretty hot, so we don't know if anybody's alive or not in his aircraft. So I broke from the Cobra I was working with and flew there, got there at altitude, stayed at altitude, and could see down there in the middle of the jungle in Vietnam had this bizarre trait. In the middle of thickest places you could ever imagine, there would be a little open area about the size of a golf green, and just a placid little, it looked like it was grass was cut. It was the strangest thing. It had something to do with the soil, I learned later. So anyhow, in the dead center of this was OH-6 that was burning, black smoke coming up. I reported that, and the captain, the platoon leader of the Cobras, um, called me and said, I can't do anything till I know if anybody's alive or not, obviously, because he wanted to move folk, he wanted to react to it, but got to find out if anybody's alive. Uh, so the only answer is for me to go down there and see. So I drop down as fast as I can, get down about treetop level or lower, and fly as fast as I can, 89 knots, right towards the burning loach on the ground. And I fly through it and pop up, and I see nothing. And Oscar sees nothing at all. And I want to make dadgum sure, so I make a slow left hand turn just to look, and bullets are flying all over the place. We see nothing. We report that and go over to another area and hold. And the radio goes quiet, unnaturally quiet. Paladin's the guy I'm talking about. So Paladin says nothing for 5 minutes. And I finally call him up and I say, what? He says, come fly to the Loc Ninh airstrip and pick up leader. And I thought, I said, what do you mean? And I said, this is not a time for jokes, as I thought, as I remember. But anyhow, I went over there, and there in the middle of their airstrip is this Cobra, Paladin's Cobra, with the front cover popped open, and there is leader. And what had happened, leader obviously survived, ran to a crater, was shooting at people, and Paladin saw that, flew over, landed right beside the crater, picked him up, popped open his, and leader jumps in the front seat. Very, very unusual way for the aircraft to operate. And he's really heavy and he can barely hover, but he saves leader's life, and is subsequently awarded the Medal of Honor, or recommended for the Medal of Honor. He wins the Distinguished Service Cross. In this, when leader was shot down, this place he crashed into was kind of marshy and wet, and as he described it, the aircraft rolled over on one of its sides. I forgot, probably the left side. Oscar was pinned in there, and he couldn't get out, and the top of the frame had him across his chest, and he was semi-crushed, and he was screaming, and he just couldn't get out. And Paris, our leader, tried all sorts of things to get him out and couldn't get him out. And leader's story was, he screamed, kill me, kill me, kill me, shoot me, shoot me, shoot me. It's horrible. So he did. So that's what happened. He was later, Paris was Paris, not a name. Leader was never the same. Just he was okay. He was on the job. He was good. That didn't change, but his personality changed slightly. He had this laugh; it just exploded, and it was such a joy thing to hear him laugh. And he never did that again. Just didn't happen. And he went. He was boarded because of what happened. He went to a board, and they didn't find anything that he did was illegal, and he came back to work. That's the story.
When leader told you that, how did you respond?
I was flying at the time. I picked him up, and that's when he said I shot him, and I remember he had a gash on his face, just blood was oozing down, and strangely, he had we wore helmets that had the eye protection came down over your face, and if you didn't, we were supposed to keep that loose because if you crashed, this thing would dig back into your nose and cause what happened with Leader. He had a piece of skin hanging down, dangling down from his own. So we were flying when he told me this, and I'm not. I don't think I believed him at the time. I couldn't explain what happened to him. I couldn't. Not that I've been negative about it. It was too fantastic to believe, but they later pulled Oscar's body out of it, and he had two bullet holes in his one between the eyes and one in his cheek. So it did happen. It was just fantastic. I just couldn't imagine it. But we didn't say a word after that. I mean, he unplugged, and I don't know. He didn't want to talk about it, and I didn't either.